but today, because of the subject matter, we need the best projectors that we have in the building. And I think also lights. Why don't we bring down the house lights while he's making this presentation? I think that'll make everything, you'll be able to see it a lot better. For a long time, I've been hoping to meet and to have to speak at the Quinton Road Baptist Church, Dr. Danny Faulkner. And Dr. Faulkner has finally arrived, and we're so thrilled that he is at Quinton Road Baptist Church, and he'll also be doing the chapel at Dayspring Bible College this coming Wednesday. And he is an astronomer. That's something that I understand he had a love for when he was in high school, and he actually started pursuing that. He has multiple degrees. He has a master's at Clemson in physics, and also a master's and a PhD from Indiana in astronomy. And we couldn't find someone better to explain what I think is one of the greatest proofs in the existence of God and the powerfulness, the greatness, the grandeur of God. It's written everywhere, but especially in the universe. And so I think you're absolutely going to love getting to know and to hear from Dr. Danny Faulkner.
Thank you. Well, Pastor, you said you couldn't find anybody better to do this, so you settled for me. Was that what your intent was? Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm excited about sharing with you a few things this morning. This morning I want to talk about biblical astronomy. You know, there were two books written in the first decade of the 20th century about this topic. And as near as I can tell, there hasn't been anything written since. So I decided that I really needed to answer that problem. So I came out with this book called The Created Cosmos 4 years ago. We have them out on the book table for sale in the lobby if you're so interested. And before I did that, I had, of course, researched the topic a bit. So I spent some time, actually several years, going through Scripture, looking for every biblical reference to astronomy that I could find. And there's a lot of them, really, more than you might imagine. So there's much material to work from. And I thought after more than 100 years, the topic was ripe for an updating and a reappraisal. You need to do that every century or so, even whether you think you need to or not. So I'm just going to give you a brief survey of some of the things that I found in Scripture, and there's much more than I say, because I wrote a book like 250 pages to say it, so there you go. Okay, the first thing you might notice when you start reading in the Bible is in the very first chapter, it starts talking about this thing called the firmament and a thing called heaven. And so I wanted to look at that, and the word firmament, it is a translation in the King James of the Hebrew word rakia. I love saying rakia. I got to kind of clear your throat as you start saying that word. By the way, I'm not a Hebrew expert at all, but I know several world-class Hebraists, and I can pick their brains anytime I want to. Call them, email them, and they'll answer my questions for me, and they've been extremely helpful. So if there's anything I have you think is good here, it's a credit to them. If you think I've got something wrong, it's my fault and my fault alone. Okay, the word rakia occurs 17 times in the Old Testament, and 9 of those times, more than half, are found in the first chapter of Genesis alone. Now, I could take some time here and talk about what the rakia is. However, that's my topic, I believe, for this evening. So I got to leave something for tonight. You'll have to come back to hear more discussion about that. The other term there is Shemayim, and that is translated heaven, or heaven sometimes. It occurs 420 times, a few more times than rakia does. And it's usually translated heaven or heavens in the King James 398 times. The other 22 times things such as air, it's translated as. And so the word occurs quite a bit more than the other one does. It's interesting that in the first chapter of Genesis in the day 2 account, there's an equation between the two. It says in the day 2 account, verse 8, it says, and God called the rakia Shemayim, and the evening and the morning were the second day. I think that's verse 8. So consequently, there's some equation between the two. But again, come back tonight to hear a little bit more about that. There are some individual star groupings and constellations that are mentioned in the Bible as well. For instance, the Pleiades. This is a photograph of the Pleiades in the background, sometimes called the Seven Sisters. In Japan, anybody know what they call it in Japan? Subaru. Yeah. You know the oval symbol with 6 stars inside? It's in that little pattern, isn't it? So if you drive one of those and you need to get a part, go to the auto parts store and ask, for like an oil filter for a 2017 Subaru and see what they say. You're just translating it for them, right? The Pleiades, though, is a star cluster. It contains about 1,000 stars. With the naked eye, you can see half dozen, a little more. In a really dark location, you can see maybe a dozen or so. Through a telescope or binoculars, you can see scores or even hundreds of them. Well, it appears 3 times in Job 9:9, Job 38:31, and also in Amos 5:8. And the Hebrew word there is kima. And kima gets across the idea of a pile of something. Like you take a pile of some handful of grain or sand and drop it down, you get a clump or a pile of these things. And I think it's really appropriate because when you see the Pleiades in the sky, and I did see it last night, barely with the bright Chicago area skies, it does look like a little pile of stars in the sky. So I think it's a very well-chosen name, and we're pretty certain that's exactly what it's talking about. Now, what's interesting is every time that the Pleiades are mentioned, it also mentions the constellation Orion with it. And Orion is a nearby constellation, pretty close in the sky. Both of these are generally known as winter constellations. If you stay up late enough, midnight or so, actually about 10 o'clock, you'll see the Pleiades in the east. And a couple hours later, Orion will rise, and it'll be up early in the morning. Now, the Hebrew word for Orion is Casil. And this word occurs 70 other times in the Bible. So it obviously has another meaning as well. And that word, Casil, is the word for fool or foolish. I should say one of the 2 words. There's another one. All 11 times that the word fool appears in Proverbs 26, that is the Hebrew word being used. Now, the word fool in English, it has 2 connotations in the biblical sense. One is someone who just doesn't act very prudently. And that's the word, that's the aspect of Casil. The other one is an impious person, someone who's a rebel against God. So one is just not very, very wise. The other one is just very wicked. Okay, so you can be both, by the way. But generally, the book of Proverbs, for instance, will distinguish between those 2 type of fools by the use of the word that may be lost in English. The context many times can tell you which fool is being talked about. All right, here is a photograph of the constellation Orion. No, it's not. It's Taurus. I can't see it real well on my screen. It's constellation Taurus. And Taurus is a bull in the sky. You can see a little V group of stars there just left of center. That is another cluster called the Hyades cluster. And it marks the face of Taurus. And you see the 2 lines going up, the 2 branches of the V there at the top. Those are the 2 horns of the bull. To the left would be the constellation of Orion. Now, if you look to the upper right of the Hyades, you can see the Pleiades. Do y'all see it there? You may have to squint to see those, but that's where the location of the Pleiades is in the sky. Now, what's interesting is many years ago, I had noticed this photograph. This is one of the exquisite photographs in the cave Lascaux in southern France, discovered, I think, back around 1940. People discovered this exquisite artwork where people in the past, a long time ago, had drawn pictures of animals on the wall there. And there's one there that has a bull. You see the bull, you see his face, you see his long horns. What do you see to the upper right of the bull's head? I see it look like 5 little stars close together, and they kind of match the pattern of the Pleiades. So many, many years ago, I looked at that and I thought, could that be a depiction of Taurus and the Pleiades? And so a few years ago, I decided to go out there searching on the internet, and I found that other people had noticed the same thing. This may be the oldest depiction of constellations we know about, and it's to tell you something about how ancient these things are. Now, they would date the Lascaux caves probably 20,000 years ago. As a biblical creationist, I would date it a lot more recently than that, but I would still think it's very old nevertheless. Here's my picture of the Orion constellation, you'll see 3 stars in a row. That's the belt of Orion. And then above it, you'll see 2 bright stars. Those mark the shoulders of Orion. 2 bright stars down below mark his knees. And then below the belt, above the knees, there's this 3 little stars in a row that marks the sword. And notice it's kind of fuzzy because there is a large object there called the Great Orion Nebula. In a really dark night, in a very dark location, clear skies, you can actually see that fuzziness with your eye. With binoculars, it's a cinch. And with the binoculars or telescope, it even gets better. Now, people try to identify different individuals with Orion. One is Nimrod, because based upon Genesis 10, 8, and 9, it says that Nimrod was a mighty hunter. And of course, Orion is the hunter. However, in my study of this, by the way, the Hebrews are said to have made this identification, but in my study of this, it indicates that that's medieval in origin. Apparently, the ancient Hebrews did not make that connection. In fact, ancient Hebrew lore is virtually non-existent. They didn't really give us anything. The supposed ancient lore of the Hebrews generally is late Middle Ages, being adapted from secular sources. Part of the reason why they did not have any sort of astronomical lore with stars and constellations was the many warnings in Scripture not to worship the heavenly beings. Now, I know that was a problem that the kingdom of Israel had and the kingdom of Judah had, and that was eventually what led to their destruction and their deportation. Once they came back from the captivity, it's interesting that the idolatry was beaten out of them finally, but it took that to do that to them. And they also did dabble pretty late in a little bit of astrology, but apparently they picked up things from other cultures, but they didn't really make them their own, as near as we can tell. We don't have any ancient Hebrew writings on the constellations, really. All right, some people see in Orion a type of Christ. And I have a real problem with that. Why would I have a problem with that? What's the Hebrew word for Orion? Kasil. What does Kasil mean in Hebrew? It means a fool. To me, that's blasphemous, because you see, Christ is not a fool, is he? So I think people sometimes want to read a little too much more into this. And I'll say more about this a little later on. As for other things in the Bible, possibly, one is Arcturus. And this is found in twice in Job, 9:9 and 38:32. And the word is Aish, and it's a bright star in the constellation Boötes. Now, we got to be careful here, because when you read Arcturus, it sounds like, well, it's talking about that star. And today we generally use that word Arcturus, that name, to refer to that bright orange star in the constellation Boötes. Now, the word itself means something like keeper of the bears. And it turns out ark is a reference to bear in Greek. That's the Greek word for bear, arctos. We get the word Arctic from that because you've got the constellation of the Big Bear, which is in the northern part of the sky. And so the word Arctic came from that association with that bear in the sky in the northern part of the sky. We even preserve the name Arctos in one of the species names of the North American brown bears. The word actually, it's Ursa arctos is the name there. Ursa being the Latin name for it. So it's many people think, and I happen to agree with this, that the name Arcturus there, by the way, which was an older name for the bear. Turns out there's a little bit of confusion. It referred to the star, and it referred to the constellation of the Big Bear, Ursa Major. So I'm of the opinion that it probably doesn't, this reference in Scripture doesn't refer to the star Arcturus. It probably refers to the Big Bear. And again, it's kind of an archaic name for you might occasionally still see it, but not very often. Some people have suggested it could refer to the Hyades cluster, but I consider that very unlikely. Here's a depiction of the constellation of the Big Bear. This is done by a guy named Bayer, B-A-Y-E. He lived 400 years ago, and he produced this wonderful atlas called Uranometria. It's this big thing, and it has depictions of the 48 constellations then understood. It's got the positions in the sky, those coordinates you can see there. The stars are plotted according to the correct position and the brightness. The bigger the spot they have there, the brighter the star. And then they also put in the artwork for this thing. And this is really exquisite. This is considered the high water mark of the representation of the various constellations. And you may recognize inside of that constellation something else. Anybody see it? What do you see there? Somebody said it. The Big Dipper is there. It marks part of the tail and the behind part of the bear there. And so that's what we normally see in the sky. If you're really in a dark location, I can pick out the other stars and give you the shape of the bear there. But most constellations are very difficult to follow. They really are. There are some, Orion's not bad, the Big Bear isn't bad, but some of them are just unbelievable. I wonder, what were they thinking? I can't see any of this up in the sky. Okay, a few other stars and constellations mentioned in the Bible. One is, if you run across the word in Job 38:32, Mazzaroth. And it's a Hebrew, in fact, this is a transliteration of the Hebrew word Mazarot. And normally when they translate Scripture, they will go directly from that language into the target language, and they will translate it. But occasionally, particularly in the Old Testament, you will come across something that's very foreign. It's not an English word at all. And in most cases when that happens, I think it's because the translator didn't know what to do with the word, didn't know how to translate it. And so instead of trying to translate it, they simply transliterated it and created a new English word in the process. So that's what why the word Mazzaroth suddenly appears, even though it's not, originally was not an English word. We still don't know the exact meaning of that word. So even today we have to kind of guess at it, and there are several possible meanings. One is it could refer to the constellations in general. There were 48 constellations handed down to us from the ancient Greeks. It was not exclusively theirs. There are other versions of the constellations around the world, but we have adopted that as being kind of the standard for everything. Another possibility would be a certain subset of those. For instance, the zodiacal constellations. There are 12 constellations along the ecliptic we call the zodiac, and that is the location of where the sun appears to move each year due to our revolution around the sun, where the moon appears throughout the month as it orbits around the earth, and also where the 5 naked eye planets are found. Those are kind of special constellations. This also gets into the origin of astrology, which I don't have time to talk about today, but I'll just say it right now, it is an ancient pagan religion. Sometimes Christians like to dabble in it, and they think it's good stuff. Well, it's not, folks. It is an ancient pagan religion, and there's plenty in Scripture that tells us to avoid those sorts of things. So a Christian has no business dabbling in any kind of astrological things. And then some people say it might be a particular subset of constellations or a particular star. Myself, I think this probably refers to the constellations in general. Not all of them necessarily, but no specific ones particularly. It's a word like we would say the constellations today. Okay, other stars and constellations mentioned. The word constellations actually appears in Isaiah 13:10, and the word there is kasilim. Anybody know enough Hebrew to know what the I-M ending on the end means? It means it's a plural, yeah. So what it's doing here is it's taking a kasil and making it plural, making several of them. Now, it's not talking about a bunch of fools. What it's doing is it's taking the name of Orion that's used among the ancient Hebrews, and it's making it a plural. So it's referring to the constellations as a general. Orion's a big bright one, so it's using it as main example, and then it's referring to all of them in that context. In 2 Kings 23:5, it has the word Mazzalah, which is very similar to Mazarot, and that's the reason why it's transliterated sometimes. Sometimes it's not. And different ways it's been translated. It could be referred to the planets. That's put a question mark on that because it's not clear what it's talking about. There are 5 naked eye planets. 3 of them are out in the evening sky now. You go out right after dark, you can see Jupiter in the southwest and Saturn just to the left of it. They look like bright stars. Off to the east or southeast, you'll see a very bright yellow, red, orange star. That is Mars. And then early in the morning, if you look towards the east, you can see Venus, and you might glimpse Mercury really low in the sky. They look like bright stars. They move around among the stars. The stars remain fixed with respect to each other, but the planets move around. Some people suggest this might refer to the constellations again, or the zodiacal signs. It's pretty clear the context here, because the phrase host of heavens also is found here as well. That host of heaven probably referring to the stars in general in the sky. Mentioning stars in general, there are several things to note. First of all, the Hebrew word for star is kokab, and it appears 26 times in the Old Testament. And 37 times they add the word kozeh to it, and you put those together and you get stargazer. This is literally star seer is what it is. So somebody who's prognosticating with the stars. Stargazer, astrologer, that's the kind of idea getting across. This generally occurred rather late. Astrology was developed in Babylonia to a large extent, and that's the Babylonian influence, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the influence there coming in late there in the kingdom. In the Hebrew, in the Greek New Testament, the word for star is aster. We get the word astrology, astronomy, astronomer. All of those come from the Greek root there. And what do we know about the stars? Well, we know from Genesis 1:16 that God made them. We know that they're innumerable in Genesis 15:5, in one of the givings of the promise to Abraham. God made the comparison to the stars in the sky. Just as the stars are innumerable, so will I make your descendants innumerable. In Joseph's second dream in Genesis 37, there are 12 stars there in his dream. And of course, those 12 stars represented 11 stars. They represented his other brothers. And it was a prophetic pronouncement of what was going to happen. It was one of two prophetic announcements of all that. The sun and the moon were his parents, of course. And the thing was, it's not clear from the dream that the account given in Genesis 37, if anybody had to explain it to him, it's pretty clear they got it. They understood. In fact, his parents were pretty wroth with him too in that particular dream. And then in Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24:17, it talks about a star rising out of Judah. In Judges 5:20, in the song of Deborah and Barak, they talk about these stars fighting for them against the enemy. In Job 38:7, they're identified with angels. It talks about the angels, morning stars singing. It's generally understood as referring to angels there. And in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, there are 7 stars in Jesus' hand, and they represent some angels and other things going on, spirit of the 7 churches. We find angels kind of alluded to with stars elsewhere in the New Testament. So that's caused some people to claim that angels are stars and stars are angels. And so they're saying that these objects we see in the sky at night are not physical objects at all, but simply manifestations of angels. I think they're going way off trying to over-spiritualize this. Sometimes you have representation on these things. People are shocked to learn this, but not everything in the Bible is literal. There are some figurative uses. You need to use your proper understanding of Scripture to see that. Jesus said he was a door, didn't he? He said he was the good shepherd, though there's no record he ever kept any sheep. At the Last Supper, he told his disciples that he was the vine and they were the branches, and then he started talking about pruning them. Those are not literal meanings, folks, and there are many other examples. Now, that doesn't mean that when you come to the Genesis account that you can go loose and free with all of this. How do you know when something is to be taken literally and how to be taken not so literally? Anybody know? Want to venture a guess? Context is extremely important, and also recognizing the genre you're in. When it comes to historical narrative, you have no right to start saying, well, days don't mean days. It's pretty clear from the context of historical narrative. It's talking about normal days in that context. Don't be confused on that. You have to rightly divide Scripture. All right. It says in Psalm 147:4 that God counts and names them. Now, already said that they're innumerable. I think from a practical standpoint, from humanity, they are innumerable. But since God created them, God made the stars, he certainly can count them. There is a number of stars out there. When you say it's innumerable, it just means it's beyond our ability to count these things. But beyond that, God names them all. That's incredible when you think about it, because how many stars are there? Well, there are a couple 100 billion stars in our own Milky Way galaxy, and there are probably at least 100 billion galaxies. I'll leave it up to an exercise to you to figure out how many stars that is. Yes, you may take your shoes off to do that. All right, they're likened to the saints in Daniel 12:3. There's a simile made there between the saints and stars. Doesn't mean the saints are stars. It's a simile after all. The Magi were guided by a star. You know, whole books have been written on that subject. Just what was that star? And you know what they've concluded? Well, many of those books conclude a definitive answer, but they're different answers. So I can conclude one thing about those answers. What can I conclude? They can't all be right. In fact, they may all be wrong. I've done some writing on this myself, and I have my ideas of what it was, but I don't want to really die on that hill, but it was not a normal star, whatever it was. So it's a very fascinating story, but it's only over a few verses in Matthew chapter 2. You're going to write whole books just over that. All right. Stars differ in glory in 1 Corinthians 15:41. It's making a comparison there to the saints, again, the church, members of the church. But, as an astronomer, I specialize in stars, and I look at stars, and they all are different. There are stars that are very similar to each other, but if you keep scratching deep enough, you will find that they've got slight differences here and there. You know, we say that the sun is a star, but it has some peculiar properties to it. For instance, stars like the sun tend to be variable. That means they get brighter and they get fainter. The sun doesn't do that. Do you understand the significance of that? What would happen if the sun got brighter and dimmer? People worry about climate change and global warming. Forget all of that, folks. It turns out, for the type of star the sun is, it's extremely rare. Most stars like the sun vary in brightness. Aren't you glad our star is different from the others? And there are there are a lot of design implications. I give a talk on design. I'm not doing it this time. Maybe next time I come, I can talk about that one. Then in Jude, we have this warning in verse 13. It's talking there about these wandering stars. And again, we're not sure what that means. It could mean the planets. It could mean meteors. We're not sure what that refers to. Book of Revelation, stars are mentioned. The seven churches are seven stars that represent the seven churches. And chapters 1 through 3. And then in Revelation 22:16, Jesus is the bright and morning star. That's really cool. The bright morning star is an incredible thing to see. Venus is that right now. It says Jesus is the bright and morning star. Well, what are some of the purposes of the stars? Well, we can go back to Genesis to look at some of those, but before we do that, I'm going to point out Psalm 8:3, Psalm 19:1, and Psalm 148:3. They talk there about the stars declaring God's glory. It's like a big billboard up in the sky. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in the church service to follow here in a little bit. But then Genesis 1:14-17 is the part of the day 4 account where God made the heavenly bodies. And he gives several purposes there. One of those is to divide the day and the night. The sun, its light largely divides it, but the moon and the stars also do part of that as well. And that's reiterated in Jeremiah 31:35. It says they're to be for signs. I got a whole chapter in my book just on what that means. One of the most obvious ones is the Magi. There was a sign in the sky that they saw. But also there's some apocalyptic things that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Jesus talked about them, and it's also found in the book of Revelation as well. It's important to try to collate those different things and try to make sense out of those. There will be signs in the heavenly bodies, and some people set the bar really low on this. Do you remember about 5 years ago, all this excitement about the 4 quote-unquote blood moons? Anybody remember that one? It was supposed to usher in the return of the Lord. As I said, that was 4 or 5 years ago. I don't think he came during that time. Now, I have many complaints about that. I wrote an article about this, actually more than one article on our website. By the way, you might, if when you have questions or encounter these kind of topics and you want to know more, try our website out, answersingenesis.org. We have tens of thousands of articles, very searchable. And so when something comes down the pike like that was a few years ago, I feel compelled. People are calling us and asking us, what is going on? What's this all about? So I wrote several articles about it, tried to battle this. A funny thing happened. After the eclipses happened and nothing happened, that's kind of disappeared. How about this one? September 23rd, 2017. Remember that one? That was the one where you had this sign in the sky of a woman in the sky and the moon at her feet, clothed in the sun, and a crown of 12 stars in her head. Anybody remember this one? That got people really going. There were books written about it. I wrote some articles about it. One of my main articles in the days leading up, the month or so leading up to September 23rd, 2017, it was the most searched article on our website. I stood there at the board and watching it. We were getting about 100,000 hits that day. Right before, and of course it plummeted afterwards. You just see it come up again and again and again and again. People were checking it out. By the way, September 24th rolled around and we're still here, right? So I've really been put out by people who really lower the bar on these things. They're seeing Rorschach tests in the heavens and they're trying to, many times it's just actually on a computer screen. They aren't actually looking up. Why look up and see it when you can do it on a computer screen? That's the way people think today. And they're seeing all sorts of great significance here. Folks, when these signs come, I think people will know it. They may not understand it, and they may not interpret it correctly, but they will know it, because these things will be perplexing. You won't be able to predict it with a computer code, and you certainly won't be able to explain it. So I'm still looking forward to these signs to be fulfilled. They're to provide the seasons, be for signs and for seasons. And for many years I read that, much of my life I read that, and I'm thinking, okay, spring, summer, autumn, and winter. That's not what it's talking about at all. That's not the only way we talk about seasons. What season is it right now? Anybody know? What? No, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about climate season. I'm talking about something else. What? No, that's over. Thankfully. Come on, folks. You know better. What season is this? It's football season. Which, by the way, I'm really sad today because my boys lost last night in double overtime. But we'll recover. All right. This football season. And then at the football season, there's a long dry spell, and then there's baseball season. We got 2 seasons, folks, football and baseball, all right? Just it, that's right. No, just 2 seasons. Don't get confused by other so-called sports out there, okay? All right. See, we use the word season a number of different ways. It's oftentimes, by the way, if you're a hunter, it could be deer season or turkey season or whatever. Seasons can be used to refer to a period of time for some purpose. And that's what the word here is used. In Hebrew, the word is moed. When it says seasons here, it's something moed. And anybody know how else the word moed is used in the Old Testament? It refers to the festivals, such as Passover. Do you all know how the date of Passover is determined? It's the 15th day of the first month in the spring, the month of Abib. And that 15th day of the month means it falls on a full moon. They had to keep calendars back then to figure out when to celebrate Passover and Pentecost and other things like that. It's tied to a lunar cycle. You ever notice that Passover bounces around on our calendar? That's because we follow the Gregorian calendar. If we followed a lunisolar calendar like the ancient Hebrews did and the Jewish calendar today does, it would occur on the 15th day of the first month every year of the religious calendar. By the way, that is the basis. The day is the natural given unit length of time. The year is a natural unit length of time, and the month is an intermediate natural unit length of time. The hours, minutes, and seconds, those are imposed. They are made up. There are 3 natural units of time I've just mentioned, the day, the month, the year, but there's one God-ordained unit of time. What is that? The week, 7-day observance. You know, in the French Revolution, in the aftermath of that, with the metric system, they tried to get rid of the week. Anybody know about that? Oh, they got really clever. They had 100 seconds to a metric minute, and 100 metric minutes to a metric hour, and 10 metric hours a day. It turned out the seconds on both systems were similar. And they came up with a calendar of 10-day weeks, 3 weeks a month. And while the other forms of metric seemed to be very popular in France, that's the one system that went the way of the De Soto. It's for some reason, ask your grandparents, they don't know what a Soto is. All right, the problem is, I think there's something basic inside of us that realizes that the week is God ordained, and we trifle with that at our peril. Just like trifling with the God ordained institution of marriage. We mess with that at our peril, and that's exactly what we're doing today. Anyway, the calendar is also the natural things in the sky will help us figure what the calendar is doing. They're also to provide light on the earth. Obviously, the sun during the daytime, but you know the moon. Anybody navigated around after dark with a full moon before? It's easy to do if you don't have trees over top of you. That can really mess things up. I used to like to play paintball with my son and his friends at night. It was a full moon. We always did it in a full moon out in the woods, and that was a whole new game. We could see well enough, not as good as the daytime, but see well enough. However, you've all seen the movie, The 10 Commandments, and they left in the middle of the afternoon, right? No, in the real Exodus, the Pharaoh calls Moses in and says, leave now. And they took off. Remember, they did the first Passover with their coats on and their shoes on. They didn't have time to leaven the bread and let it rise. They had to be ready to go with their staff in their hand, their bags packed. They left at night, folks. And what was the phase of the moon? It was full. No torches necessary, no headlights on your vehicles. You could walk and get a head start before the Egyptians decided to catch up with you later on. God's providence again. I have driven along at night a few times on a lonely road, stretch of road during a full moon, and I've turned the headlights off. Everybody ever done this before? Uh-huh. And if it's a full moon, can you see where you're going? Yes, you can, as it turns out. And I only do that briefly because I'm always afraid there could be another guy like you raised your hand coming the other direction. And I may not see you, and you may not see. I can see the road, but I can't see you. So I'll do it occasionally, just flip it off. I haven't done it in years, but on a lonely road, stretch road, you can actually see with a full moon. And you know what? If you go to a really dark location, like I have been blessed to go to some of these great observatories I've been, I go outside, my eyes get dark adapted, and I can see well enough by starlight to walk around. So yeah, the stars provide light upon the earth as well. Okay, again, the signs, we can use the stars for navigation. Certainly the Magi did in a very special way. But we can also use them for weather. Jesus talked in Matthew 6, 2, and 3, not about the stars, but about the heavens. The old red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in morning, sailor take warning. It's found right there, just termed a little differently there. Testimony to God. Again, Psalm 8, Psalm 19. Also the coming judgment, Isaiah 13:10, Joel 2:10, Joel 3:15, Matthew 24:29, Revelation 8:12. That's just some of the examples of passages of Scripture dealing with signs yet to come in the heavens. Okay, again, I've already talked about the signs of the seasons. Don't refer to the climatic seasons. They refer to the festivals. And the Hebrew calendar is lunar. Technically, it's actually lunisolar calendar, and timekeeping and such. A few other considerations. Job mentions these star groupings and things in the heavens, and it's immediately followed by weather-related things and seasonal things. If you read an old farmer's almanac, you'll find the same sort of thing mentioned. And when I learned this, reading this a few years ago, I thought, wow, that's really cool. I started looking into these things, and you'll find references in all sorts of ancient cultures to seeing things in the sky at certain times of year. Like this time of year, the Pleiades start to become obvious. and that indicates you're well into autumn at that point. To the Celtic civilization, that was very important. The Pleiades were very important. This time of year was very important. However, there's always a danger, mentioning pagans, always a danger of pagan perversion. It can give rise to astrology and things like that. All right, here's some other speculation we have. We have what some people call the gospel in the stars. Anybody heard of the gospel in the stars? This stuff was concocted about 160 years ago. It was promoted by E.W. Bullinger a few decades later, Joseph Seiss as well, and there have been a number of books ever since. Even D. James Kennedy got into the game a few decades ago. And it's this idea that you get these constellations in the sky, star names and constellations that give across this salvation message, supposedly before the scripture was given to us. I have spent much of the last 40 years investigating this, and I think it's pretty bad stuff for the most part. In fact, it's really bad. I've written quite a bit about it. I put 3 chapters about it in this book that I shamelessly keep promoting here this morning. However, there's one possible exception, and this is the one that I'm surprised that Gospel of the Star advocates don't talk about that much, because to me, if there's anything in the sky that could possibly be some sort of proto-gospel of some sort, this is it. There's a constellation we call Hercules today, but in ancient sources, he was called the Kneeler. He's always depicted as a guy here on one knee like this in the sky. I can't quite pick that out, but I'll just, okay, if you help me out, I can see it there in the sky. Now, what's interesting is there's another constellation nearby called Draco. And usually people say Draco or the dragon because the word Draco and dragon are similarly related. The problem is the word Draco doesn't really mean a dragon. It actually refers to some sort of serpent-like creature. In fact, all the depictions showed as a serpent, not as a dragon or a crocodile or lizard or something like that. So you've got this person kneeling, and he's got his foot, the one he's not kneeling on, over the head of a serpent. Does that sound vaguely familiar to anybody? That's right out of Genesis 3:15, isn't it? Part of the curse there when it says the seed, referring to the seed of the woman, not the seed of Adam, but the seed of the woman. It said that, talking to the serpent, you will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. Did you ever see Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ? One thing that impressed me in there are several things that did, but one thing that impressed me is as soon as the crucifixion was done, you saw a sandaled foot come down on the head of a snake. Anybody remember seeing that? I mean, I was like, whoa, Mel Gibson gets it. Genesis 3:15 right there. I'm not saying that this is a memorial to this or whatever. I'm simply saying that if there's any validity to the gospel stars, this would be the one thing that I wouldn't necessarily oppose. Now, I'll close with this. There was a guy named Richard Proctor, late 19th century. He was a promoter of astronomy back then, an amazing man. I've read several of his books, and I think it was really cool. And he noticed something that somewhat along the lines of this, but in a totally different direction. I think it's fascinating. There's this thing in the sky, a shift of positions we call precession, which causes the stars' positions to shift. By the way, here's the kneeler, by the way. Okay, sorry about this, I had to censor this one. One of the constellations that up in the sky about 2,500 years ago would be, marching across the sky would be Aquarius. And he's supposed to be a person with water, but actually it's the oldest depictions don't have a person at all. They simply have jugs of water pouring the water out. So this constellation of Aquarius starts to go across the sky, and it's pouring water out, and the next constellation comes along as a couple of fish. We call it Pisces today, and water is dumping onto the fish. Now, you don't see this in temperate latitudes so much today because of the change in precession, but around 4,500 years ago, you saw then the next constellation come along, this large ship. Argo Navis, it's called. And they show there just a part of the ship, but there actually could have been the whole ship at one point. Over top of this, above where this ship is, there's one of the longest constellations called Hydra, and it's basically a line going across the sky. And he was suggesting you've got the ship sitting here and a line up here like a horizon line. There's water here and sky above. It makes a really nice picture. And many people think it was a line. And up along that line is this raven that's flying in the sky. And then as it continues to slide across, you get this water dumping out on some fish. And then the next thing picture comes along is this big ship with a line with a raven flying across, and it moves off. And then the next thing that comes along is a constellation of Centaurus. Now, Centaurus is a centaur. The back half there is a horse, which these things don't exist. Proctor suggested, this is the one place where he kind of went off the standard stuff here, but I think he had a good idea. What if, remember the ship was only half a ship, the left half was missing. What if originally the whole ship was there? You could borrow stars from the backside of Centaurus, and when you do that, you suddenly don't have a centaur anymore, you have a man. All right? And he's got kind of a staff that he's holding, you can see there, and they've got this creature sitting there. It's an animal, looks like it's maybe dead. And then off to the left of that, there is this altar there. Does anybody see where this is going? This is what the sky would have looked like 4,500 years ago from about 35 degrees north latitude. You'd have water dumping out on fish, with now a ship showing up with a horizon line and the raven flying above that. And then a man walking away from the ship with a sacrificial animal about to be placed on an altar. If you know the Genesis account of the flood, that's the basic story. And so Proctor suggested that these constellations may have been a depiction of that. Well, my time's expired. Thank you very much. I'll see you in a few minutes in the church service.